It was a quiet Tuesday evening at Benny's Roadhouse, a bar so forgotten by time that even its neon sign flickered as if unsure of its purpose. The place wasn't glamorous, just four walls, a jukebox, and a few scratched tables spread across the room. Dust hung in the air, catching the dim light like a haze of secrets that lingered long after closing time. The bartender, Joe, was working the counter, methodically wiping glasses that didn't need wiping. It was his way of passing time in the kind of bar where nothing exciting ever happened. Most nights, Benny's had the same crowd of regulars, tired truckers, a couple of locals nursing their misfortunes, and a few passers-by who stumbled in by mistake. But tonight, someone different sat at the far end of the bar. The man didn't draw attention to himself. He wore a battered leather jacket with faded patches, the kind that hinted at years on the road. His jeans were worn, his boots scuffed, and his posture unassuming. Yet, there was something about him, an aura, maybe, that made people instinctively give him space. He wasn't chatty like the regulars, nor did he carry the restless energy of someone looking for trouble. Instead, he sat still, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he cradled a glass of whiskey. His hands were strong and calloused, the kind of hands that told stories of labor, struggle, and maybe even violence. His face, though not unkind, bore lines that hinted at years lived hard and fast. His eyes, though that was the real giveaway. They weren't just looking at the wall across from him, they seemed to pierce through it, as if seeing something no one else could. Memories, perhaps. Regrets. Or maybe just the echoes of places he'd rather forget. Joe noticed him, of course bartenders notice everything. But he didn't ask questions. In a place like Benny's, silence was currency, and privacy was respected. The man had come in quietly, paid for his drink in cash, and hadn't said a word since. And so, life at Benny's hummed along in its usual, unremarkable way. The jukebox played old country tunes, soft enough that the occasional clink of glasses or scrape of a chair could still be heard. A couple of locals sat at a corner table, playing cards and mumbling about the weather. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the windows just enough to remind everyone how isolated this little bar really was. Then the door slammed open. The sound startled everyone. The jukebox skipped, cutting Johnny Cash mid-verse. Heads turned as a group of bikers stomped in, bringing with them an air of arrogance and a whiff of gasoline. There were 5 of them, each clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and skulls. Their leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and a smug expression, strode in first, surveying the room like he owned it. He was flanked by his crew, a wiry guy with a cigarette dangling from his lips, a burly man with a shaved head, and 2 others who looked more like shadows than individuals. Joe stiffened behind the bar. He knew the type. These weren't the friendly kind of bikers who stopped in for a quick beer. No, these were the troublemakers, the kind who thrived on making everyone else uncomfortable. "Evenin', folks," the leader said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Hope we're not interrupting." The locals at the card table quickly gathered their things and moved to a quieter corner. Joe forced a smile, though his hand hovered near the baseball bat he kept under the counter. "What'll it be?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. The bikers swaggered up to the bar, making themselves at home. They barked their orders, beer for some, whiskey for others, and made a show of slamming coins onto the counter. At first, they didn't notice the man at the far end of the bar. He stayed quiet, his gaze steady and unflinching, as if he hadn't even registered their presence. But eventually, the leader's eyes wandered. "Who's this?" he asked, nodding toward the lone figure. Joe hesitated. "Just a customer," he said, his voice tight. The leader grinned, a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "He don't look like much of a customer. More like a stray dog." His crew laughed on cue, the sound loud and grating. The man at the bar didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He simply took another sip of his whiskey, his movements slow and deliberate. The leader didn't like being ignored. "Hey, pal, you got ears? My buddy here's talking to you." Joe's hand inched closer to the bat, but his gut told him it wouldn't help. He glanced at the man at the bar, hoping for a sign, any sign that he wasn't about to witness a disaster. But the man remained calm, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was thick with tension. The locals held their breath, and even the jukebox seemed to grow quieter. The leader took a step closer, his grin fading into something colder. "You gonna answer me, or do I have to make you?" he asked, his voice low. Still, the man didn't react. He just set his glass down on the counter with a soft clink and finally turned his head to look at the leader. And for the first time, the bikers hesitated. There was something in his eyes, something hard and unyielding, like steel forged in fire. It wasn't anger, exactly, or even fearlessness. It was the look of a man who'd seen things, done things, and come out the other side with nothing left to prove. The leader faltered, just for a second, before recovering with a forced laugh. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a tough guy," he said, though his bravado sounded hollow. The man didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just waited. And in the silence that followed, it became clear to everyone in the room, whatever the bikers thought they were about to start, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The leader's bravado wavered for just a split second. It was subtle, only noticeable if you were really looking. But Joe, the bartender, caught it. He had spent enough years dealing with all types to recognize when someone was bluffing, and the leader, despite his loud demeanor, had just been thrown off balance. Joe's eyes flicked to the man at the far end of the bar. He didn't seem concerned, didn't shift in his seat, and didn't even bother to glance at the others in the room. He just sat there, still as a stone, fingers lightly draped over his glass. The leader straightened, puffing out his chest like a rooster in a fight it wasn't sure it could win. "You think you're funny?" he asked, stepping closer to the man. His boots thudded against the old wooden floor, each step sounding heavier than the last. The room was silent now, save for the low hum of the jukebox, which had cycled into another slow country ballad. Even the regulars, who usually kept their heads down and their noses out of trouble, were watching from the shadows. Nobody wanted to get involved, but nobody could look away, either. The man finally broke his stillness. He turned his head slightly, just enough to let his gaze meet the leader's. His face was calm, unreadable, and his voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. "Not trying to be funny," he said simply. The leader stopped in his tracks, momentarily thrown by the man's composure. He had expected fear or maybe anger, anything but this calm, almost indifferent response. His crew, though, wasn't as perceptive. One of them, the wiry guy with the cigarette, laughed and nudged the leader's shoulder. "Come on, boss," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "This guy's nothing. Just some washed-up old loner. Probably hasn't thrown a punch in years." The leader smirked, regaining some of his confidence. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said, his tone shifting back to its usual arrogance. He took another step closer, leaning down until his face was inches from the man's. "Here's the thing," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is my bar now. So why don't you take your little drink, get up, and walk out before things get messy?" The man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he reached for his glass and took another slow sip, his eyes never leaving the leader's. When he set the glass back down, the soft clink against the wood sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the tense silence. "You sure about that?" the man asked, his voice quiet but with a weight that seemed to fill the room. The leader straightened, a scowl darkening his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," the man said, leaning back slightly, "you might want to think twice about making this your bar." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado slipping just a little. The leader, though, wasn't about to back down. He had a reputation to uphold, and he wasn't going to let some quiet stranger ruin it. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said, reaching out to grab the man by the collar. But before his hand could make contact, the man moved. It was so fast that most people didn't even see it happen. One moment, the leader's hand was reaching forward, and the next, it was pinned against the bar, the man's grip like a steel vise. The leader yelped in pain, his knees buckling slightly as he tried to pull away. But the man didn't let go. He stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over the leader. "Here's the thing," the man said, his voice still calm but now carrying a distinct edge. "I don't like bullies. Never have." The leader struggled, his face twisting in pain and embarrassment. His crew started to step forward, but the man's gaze snapped to them, freezing them in their tracks. "I wouldn't," he said simply. There was something in his voice, a quiet authority that demanded obedience. The bikers hesitated, looking to their leader for direction, but he was too busy trying to free himself from the man's unyielding grip. Joe, still standing behind the bar, felt his pulse quicken. He had seen fights break out in Benny's before, but this was different. This wasn't just some drunk brawl. This was something else entirely, something controlled, precise, and unnervingly efficient. The man finally released the leader's hand, letting him stumble back into his crew. The leader clutched his wrist, his face red with a mix of pain and humiliation. "You son of a," he started, but the man cut him off. "Don't," the man said, his voice low but firm. "You don't want to finish that sentence." The leader hesitated, his anger warring with a growing sense of unease. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who didn't even raise his voice. "You've made your point," Joe interjected suddenly, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe it's time for everyone to cool off." The leader shot him a glare, but it lacked its usual fire. He turned back to the man, his jaw tightening. "This ain't over," he said, his voice thick with barely concealed rage. The man didn't respond. He simply sat back down, picked up his glass, and took another sip of whiskey as if nothing had happened. The bikers lingered for a moment, their pride clearly wounded, but they eventually turned and shuffled out of the bar. The leader was the last to leave, throwing one last glare over his shoulder before slamming the door behind him. The room was quiet again, save for the soft hum of the jukebox. Joe let out a shaky breath and leaned against the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He finished his drink, set the empty glass on the counter, and stood up. "Just passing through," he said simply, tossing a few bills on the bar. Joe watched him walk to the door, his movements steady and deliberate. As the man stepped out into the night, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something far more significant than a bar fight. And as the door swung shut, the silence that filled the room felt heavier than ever. The gang barged in like they owned the place, their voices booming and their boots clomping against the worn wooden floor. The quiet hum of Benny's Roadhouse was obliterated in an instant, replaced by their harsh laughter and crude remarks. 5 of them filled the room with their presence, all leather and attitude. They weren't just customers, they were a spectacle. The leader stood out, a towering brute with a scraggly beard, a chipped tooth that gleamed when he grinned, and eyes that scanned the room for something or someone to dominate. His leather jacket was adorned with patches that screamed rebellion, the back bearing a snarling wolf emblem that matched the gang's feral energy. "Whiskey," the leader barked at Joe, the bartender, without looking in his direction. His tone carried the weight of someone who didn't ask, but demanded. Joe moved quickly, not wanting to draw attention to himself. His hands trembled slightly as he poured the drink, the bottle clinking against the glass. "Here you go," he said, setting it down. The leader ignored the courtesy and grabbed the glass, downing it in one gulp before slamming it onto the counter. The sharp sound made everyone flinch, except for the lone man at the far end of the bar. The gang spread out, their movements calculated. They shoved chairs aside with their boots, claimed tables without a second glance at the regulars who quietly retreated to the shadows. One of them, a wiry man with a cigarette hanging precariously from his lips, flicked ash onto the floor, grinning at the discomfort it caused. Another, a burly, bald man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned against the jukebox, inspecting it like it was a toy he might break just for fun. "This thing play anything good," he sneered, slamming a fist against it. The jukebox skipped, the music stuttering before resuming its soft hum. But the gang's energy shifted as their eyes landed on the lone man sitting at the bar. He hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged their presence. He sat with his back straight but relaxed, his hands resting on either side of his drink. His leather jacket, old and weathered, bore no emblems or patches, just the scars of time and use. The leader's grin widened as he strode over, his boots echoing against the floor. Well, he drawled, leaning in close over the man's shoulder. "What do we have here?" A quiet little loner, sipping his sorrows away. The man didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head. Instead, he lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and set it down gently. The calmness in his actions was louder than any insult, and it grated on the leader's nerves. "Hey," the leader barked, slapping the counter. "I'm talking to you." Still, the man didn't flinch. He reached for a napkin, wiped the rim of his glass, and continued as if the gang wasn't even there. The leader's expression darkened. "You deaf or just stupid?" One of the gang members, a lanky man with a raspy voice, stepped closer. "Our boss is talking to ya, buddy," he said, his tone sharp and threatening. The tension in the room was suffocating now. The regulars, who had tried to melt into the background, watched with wide eyes. Joe, frozen behind the bar, glanced nervously between the bikers and the lone man. His instincts told him this wasn't going to end well. The leader smirked, leaning even closer. "Maybe he's shy," he said, his voice mocking. "Don't worry, pal, we'll help you come out of your shell." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the man's shoulder. Before anyone could blink, the man moved. It wasn't a flinch, and it wasn't frantic. It was quick, precise, and deliberate. His hand shot up, grabbing the leader's wrist in a grip so firm it made the towering brute wince. The entire bar went silent. The leader's grin faltered as he tried to pull away, but the man's grip didn't budge. He looked up then, slowly, his eyes locking onto the leader's. And those eyes, cold, sharp, and unyielding, sent a ripple of unease through the gang. "You should let go," the man said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The leader hesitated, his bravado wavering. "You've got some nerve," he muttered, trying to mask his discomfort. The man released his wrist with a small shove, making the leader stumble back a step. Then he turned back to his drink, as if nothing had happened. The gang exchanged uncertain glances. Their leader was rarely challenged, and even when he was, it never ended this way, with him stepping back instead of pushing forward. But he wasn't about to let it go. His pride was on the line. "You think you're tough, huh?" he snarled, his voice louder now, trying to reassert his dominance. "You don't know who you're messing with." The man didn't respond. Scarface, the burly one by the jukebox, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Boss, want me to teach him some manners?" The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between the man and his crew. He wanted to say yes, but something about the stranger made him pause. There was a stillness, a quiet confidence that felt more dangerous than any show of strength. Finally, the leader sneered. "Not yet," he said, waving Scarface back. Let's see how long this guy can keep his cool. He leaned closer again, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. But don't think this is over, pal. We're just getting started. The man didn't even glance his way. The jukebox hummed softly, the tension thick enough to choke on. The gang retreated slightly, but the storm was far from over. Everyone in the bar knew it was just the beginning. Joe exhaled shakily, wiping his sweaty palms on a towel. He looked at the man, his gut twisting with worry. Who was this guy? And more importantly, what had he just set in motion? The leader took a step back, his chest heaving with barely suppressed anger. He wasn't used to being ignored, much less manhandled. His reputation was everything, and this stranger was threatening it without even breaking a sweat. The other gang members circled like vultures, their tension palpable. They exchanged glances, waiting for the signal to strike, but the leader held up a hand. Not yet, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He wasn't done playing this game. The man at the bar remained unmoved. His posture was as calm as ever, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his glass. It was almost like he was waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The leader smirked, masking his unease with bravado. All right, tough guy, he said, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. You want to act all mysterious and cool? Fine. But you're gonna wish you walked out that door when you had the chance. He snapped his fingers, and one of the bikers, a wiry, tattooed man with a face that seemed permanently twisted into a sneer, stepped forward. Show him how we handle disrespect, the leader ordered. The wiry man grinned, cracking his knuckles as he sauntered toward the bar. The tension in the room thickened, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding. The wiry biker leaned over the bar, inches from the man's face. You got a death wish, old man, he sneered, his breath reeking of cheap beer and cigarettes. The man didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Cat got your tongue, the wiry man mocked, his voice growing louder. Or maybe you're just too scared to talk. Still, the man remained silent. The wiry biker's grin faltered, frustration creeping into his expression. He reached out, grabbing the man's glass and tossing it onto the floor. The shattering sound echoed through the bar, drawing gasps from the regulars. Oops, the biker said, his tone dripping with mockery. Guess you'll have to order another. For the first time, the man moved. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the wiry bikers. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, just an unsettling calm that made the biker take an involuntary step back. You shouldn't have done that, the man said, his voice low and measured. The wiry biker hesitated, his confidence wavering. But then the leader's voice cut through the air. Don't let him scare you, Kenny, he barked. Take him down a peg. Kenny clenched his fists, bolstered by his boss's command. He stepped closer, towering over the seated man. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Kenny taunted. You're outnumbered, old man. You gonna fight all of us? The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. With deliberate calm, he bent down, picking up the larger shards of glass from the floor and placing them on the bar. The act was so unexpected, so disarming, that Kenny hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like the stranger wasn't going to retaliate at all. But then the man stood up. He wasn't particularly tall, but there was something about the way he carried himself, an air of quiet authority that seemed to fill the room. His movements were slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Kenny's. I don't like making messes, the man said, his voice steady. But if you want to push me, I'll make an exception. The threat was subtle, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down Kenny's spine. He glanced over his shoulder at the leader, silently asking for backup. The leader narrowed his eyes, weighing his options. This stranger wasn't acting like an ordinary man. He wasn't pleading or posturing, he was simply waiting, like a predator watching its prey stumble into a trap. Enough games, the leader growled, stepping forward. Let's see what you're really made of. He gestured to the other bikers, who began closing in around the man. The regulars in the bar shrank back, their fear palpable. Joe, the bartender, looked like he wanted to intervene, but he knew better. Don't do this, Joe said quietly, his voice trembling. You don't know who you're messing with. The leader barked a laugh. Oh, and you do, he shot back, glaring at Joe. Joe didn't answer. He just looked at the man, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and respect. The man glanced at Joe, giving him a small nod. Then he turned his attention back to the gang, his expression unreadable. You have one chance to walk away, the man said, his voice calm but unyielding. Take it. The leader laughed again, louder this time, his bravado returning in full force. Or what? He sneered. You gonna take us all on by yourself? The man didn't answer. He simply rolled up the sleeves of his jacket, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scars, marks of a life that had seen more than its fair share of violence. The gang hesitated, their confidence faltering once more. But the leader refused to back down. Get him, he ordered, his voice sharp. The first biker lunged, his fists swinging wildly. And that's when it happened. The man moved like a shadow, swift and precise. He sidestepped the attack effortlessly, grabbing the biker's arm and twisting it in one fluid motion. There was a sickening crack, followed by a scream of pain as the biker dropped to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The room erupted into chaos. Another biker charged, but the man was ready. He ducked under the punch, driving his elbow into the attacker's stomach with enough force to send him sprawling. The third and fourth bikers hesitated, glancing at their fallen comrades before rushing in together. But it didn't matter. The man was faster, stronger, and far more skilled. Within seconds, both were on the ground, groaning in pain. The leader watched in stunned silence as his crew was dismantled one by one. His fists clenched, his jaw tightening as he realized he had underestimated this stranger. You want to be next? The man asked, his voice calm and steady. The leader hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the question. Joe watched from behind the bar, his heart pounding. He didn't know who this man was, but one thing was clear: he wasn't just some drifter. This was a man with a past. A dangerous one. And for the first time in years, Benny's Roadhouse was completely silent. The leader's chuckle was low and menacing, reverberating through the bar like distant thunder. He didn't notice the shift in the room's energy, or, if he did, he ignored it. His crew stood behind him, their bravado masking the creeping uncertainty that had begun to settle in. Apologize, the man repeated, his tone flat. He leaned back on the stool, his posture relaxed but his eyes unyielding. For what? The leader sneered, pointing at the empty seat beside the man. That's my spot, he growled. And you're sitting in it? So, why don't you be a good boy and move? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, as though the world around him didn't exist. When he set the glass down, the faint sound of the ice settling filled the silence. I think I'll stay, he said simply, his voice calm. The leader's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Wrong answer, he spat, slamming his fist on the bar again. That's when the bartender noticed the tattoo. It was partially obscured by the cuff of the man's jacket, but the unmistakable design, a pair of wings spread wide, with a dagger piercing through the center, sent a chill down Joe's spine. Joe swallowed hard, his hands gripping the counter to steady himself. Hey, fellas, he said, his voice trembling. Maybe you should just leave this one alone. Trust me on this. The leader turned his glare on Joe. What's your problem, old man? he snapped. Joe shook his head, his eyes darting to the tattoo and then back to the leader. "You don't want to mess with him," he said quietly. The leader let out a bark of laughter, his bravado returning in full force. "Oh, yeah. And why's that?" Joe didn't answer. He just looked at the man, who remained still, his gaze locked on the leader. There was something in those eyes, something cold and dangerous, like a storm brewing on the horizon. But the bikers weren't interested in subtle warnings. They had an audience now, and their pride wouldn't let them back down. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" one of the bikers, a wiry man with a cocky grin, taunted. "Sitting here, acting all mysterious. Newsflash, buddy, you're outnumbered." The man finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He adjusted his jacket, revealing more of the tattoo on his wrist. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man said, his voice steady. "But if you want it, you'll get it." The leader smirked, mistaking the man's calmness for weakness. "Big talk for a guy who's all alone," he said, taking a step closer. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes boring into the leader's. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Walk away." The leader laughed again, louder this time, as if trying to convince himself he wasn't rattled. "Or what?" he sneered. Joe's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Don't," he said, his tone urgent. "Listen to me. That tattoo, he's not just some drifter. He's..." The man shot Joe a warning glance, and the bartender's words trailed off. But it was too late. The bikers had already dismissed the warning, their egos too big to heed caution. "Enough of this crap," the leader snarled. He lunged forward, grabbing the man by the front of his jacket. In an instant, the room exploded into chaos. The man moved with a speed and precision that left the bikers and everyone else in the bar stunned. His hand shot up, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it in a way that made him cry out in pain. With a swift motion, the man shoved the leader backward, sending him stumbling into a table. The other bikers froze for a moment, caught off guard by the display of strength and skill. But their hesitation didn't last long. "Get him," one of them shouted, and the rest surged forward. The man didn't wait. He stepped into the first attacker's swing, deflecting the punch and delivering a sharp jab to the ribs that sent the biker crumpling to the floor. The second attacker came at him with a broken bottle, but the man sidestepped the wild swing and grabbed the biker's arm, twisting it until the bottle clattered to the ground. A swift kick to the back of the knee sent the biker sprawling. By now, the remaining bikers were rethinking their strategy. They circled cautiously, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He adjusted his jacket, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Do you really want to find out?" he asked, his tone calm but deadly. The leader, still clutching his wrist, pushed himself to his feet. His face was red with anger and humiliation. "Don't just stand there," he barked at his crew. "Take him down." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other. They weren't sure what they were up against, but it was clear this man wasn't an ordinary drifter. Joe watched from behind the bar, his heart pounding. He knew now what that tattoo meant. He'd heard the stories, the rumors about a special forces unit that operated in the shadows, taking on missions no one else could handle. Men like that didn't just fade into the background. The leader, desperate to regain control, lunged at the man again. But this time, the man was ready. With a fluid motion, he sidestepped the attack, grabbing the leader by the back of his jacket and slamming him onto the bar. The impact made the glasses jump, and the leader let out a groan of pain. The man leaned in close, his voice low but firm. "I told you to walk away," he said. The leader's bravado crumbled, replaced by fear. The other bikers froze, unsure whether to intervene or cut their losses. The man straightened, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Anyone else?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with an unspoken threat. The silence was deafening. One by one, the bikers backed away, their bravado evaporating. Joe exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. The man picked up his glass, now empty, and set it back on the bar. "Thanks for the drink," he said to Joe, his tone polite. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps unhurried. The bikers watched him go, their pride bruised and their courage drained. But as the door swung shut behind him, the leader's voice broke the silence. "This ain't over," he muttered, his tone dark and vengeful. "Not by a long shot." The bikers regrouped slowly, their bravado replaced by tension and the sting of humiliation. The leader, still leaning on the bar, gritted his teeth as he straightened himself. His crew stood around him, their previous confidence shaken by the mysterious man who had just walked out the door. "Boss," one of them muttered, "maybe we should let it go. That guy, he's not normal." The leader shot him a glare, his pride too wounded to consider retreat. "You think I'm gonna let some drifter make a fool out of me? No chance." "But the way he moved," another biker said, his voice laced with unease. "That ain't someone who just picked up a few tricks in bar fights. He's trained." "Shut up," the leader snapped, slamming his palm on the bar. His crew flinched, their loyalty warring with their instincts to avoid further conflict. "I don't care who he is. Nobody humiliates me in my own territory." The bartender, Joe, listened quietly, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the counter. He knew the type. The leader was the kind of man who wouldn't rest until he restored his dominance, even if it meant dragging his crew into something they couldn't handle. Joe cleared his throat, trying one last time to reason with him. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. "You don't know what you're dealing with. That tattoo, he's not just any ex-military. He's one of them." The leader frowned, turning his glare on Joe. "One of who?" Joe hesitated, glancing at the door as if the man might reappear at any moment. "They called them the Ghost Division," he said finally. "Special Forces. Black Ops. The kind of missions they don't put on the news. If he's got that tattoo, he's the real deal." The room fell silent. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado draining further. But the leader refused to let fear take hold. "I don't care if he's the damn president," he growled. "He's not gonna walk into my bar, disrespect me, and get away with it." Joe sighed, shaking his head. "It's your funeral." The leader ignored him, turning to his crew with a determined look. "Get the bikes," he ordered. "We're gonna find him." Outside, the man walked down the empty road, the faint hum of crickets and the distant rumble of engines the only sounds in the night. He didn't look back, he didn't need to. He knew they would come after him. He pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, his mind calm and focused. This wasn't the first time he'd been hunted, and it wouldn't be the last. He had learned long ago that trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran or how well he hid. Tonight was no different. The faint sound of engines grew louder, and he glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. The bikers were coming, their headlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hostility. The man sighed, stepping off the road and into the shadows of a nearby grove of trees. He moved with practiced ease, his steps silent and deliberate. By the time the bikers arrived, he was gone. The leader slowed his bike, squinting into the darkness. "Where'd he go?" he barked, his frustration mounting. The others spread out, their engines idling as they scanned the area. "He couldn't have gone far," one of them muttered. The leader dismounted, pulling a flashlight from his saddlebag. He stalked toward the grove, his jaw set in determination. "Spread out," he ordered. He's hiding. Find him. The bikers obeyed, their movements cautious as they ventured into the trees. The leader's flashlight cut through the shadows, but the further he went, the more the oppressive silence seemed to close in around him. "Boss," one of the bikers called out, his voice wavering. "This doesn't feel right." "Shut up and keep looking," the leader snapped. He refused to believe he could be outmaneuvered by one man. But the man wasn't just any man. Hidden in the shadows, the man watched their every move. His breathing was steady, his mind sharp as he calculated his next steps. These bikers were loud, clumsy, and predictable, the kind of opponents he had been trained to dismantle. One of the bikers passed close by, his flashlight casting long, erratic beams of light across the trees. The man waited until the light swung away, then moved silently behind him. Before the biker could react, the man's arm was around his neck, pulling him into a chokehold that rendered him unconscious within seconds. The man lowered him gently to the ground, retrieving the flashlight before disappearing back into the shadows. One by one, the bikers fell. The man moved like a ghost, striking with precision and vanishing before the others could react. The grove became a battleground of whispers and muffled grunts, the bikers' confidence crumbling with each comrade they lost. By the time the leader realized what was happening, it was too late. He stood alone in the clearing, the silence around him deafening. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding. "Come out," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Fight me like a man." The man stepped out of the shadows, his movements calm and deliberate. He held the flashlight he had taken from the first biker, its beam illuminating the leader's terrified face. "I gave you a chance," the man said, his tone even. "You should have walked away." The leader raised his fists, his desperation overriding his fear. "You don't scare me," he spat, charging forward. The fight was over before it began. The man sidestepped the charge, his movements fluid and precise. He grabbed the leader's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground in one swift motion. The leader struggled, but the man's grip was unrelenting. "Listen to me," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want this fight. Walk away now, and it ends here." The leader groaned, his pride warring with the reality of his defeat. Finally, he nodded, the fight draining out of him. "Fine," he muttered. "You win." The man released him, stepping back and watching as the leader scrambled to his feet. The bikers, battered and humiliated, regrouped slowly, their eyes avoiding the man's gaze. "Get out of here," the man said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They retreated to their bikes, their humiliation palpable as they roared off into the night. Joe watched from the bar as the man returned, his expression calm as ever. He walked in, took his seat, and gestured for another drink. Joe poured it without a word, setting the glass in front of him. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. The man shrugged. "They wouldn't have stopped otherwise." Joe studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." The man took a sip of his drink, his eyes distant. He didn't speak, and Joe didn't press him. Some stories were better left untold. The bar settled back into its usual rhythm, the tension fading as quickly as it had arrived. But for those who had witnessed the night's events, one thing was clear: the quiet man at the bar was not someone to be underestimated. The bar was silent except for the groans of the bikers sprawled across the floor. Glasses were shattered, tables overturned, and the jukebox sputtered as if unsure whether to keep playing. The bartender, Joe, stood frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking as he tried to process what had just happened. The man stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. He adjusted his jacket as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Around him, the gang of bikers, who had stormed in like a pack of wolves, were reduced to broken, moaning heaps. The leader, clutching his ribs, struggled to his knees. His face was a mix of rage and disbelief as he glared up at the man. "What the hell are you?" he spat, his voice thick with pain. The man turned to him, his gaze calm but unyielding. "Someone who told you to walk away," he said simply. His voice was steady, but there was a gravity to it that made even Joe shiver. The leader gritted his teeth and forced himself to his feet. "You think you've won," he growled, wobbling as he reached into his jacket. A glint of metal caught the dim bar like a knife, curved and wickedly sharp. "Nobody humiliates me and gets away with it." The man didn't move. His eyes locked onto the blade, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his tone so calm it only enraged the leader further. The leader lunged, the knife arcing through the air. But the man stepped aside with fluid precision, his hand snapping out like a viper. He grabbed the leader's wrist, twisting it in a way that made him cry out and drop the weapon. In the same motion, the man yanked the leader forward, slamming him face first into the bar. The knife clattered to the floor as the leader groaned in pain, his bravado crushed. The remaining bikers tried to rise, but a single glance from the man stopped them cold. He didn't need to say anything, his presence alone was enough to freeze them in place. Joe finally found his voice. What just happened?" he whispered, his words barely audible. The man turned to him, his expression softening slightly. "Just cleaning up a mess," he said. But Joe wasn't satisfied with the answer. "That's not normal," he said, gesturing to the unconscious bikers. "You moved like you've done this before." "A lot." The man didn't respond. He picked up a fallen chair, righted it, and sat back down at the bar. Joe hesitated, then poured him another drink, his hands shaking. "You're not just some drifter, are you?" The man took the drink but didn't answer. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve slightly, revealing the tattoo on his wrist, the wings and dagger Joe had noticed earlier. The leader, still slumped against the bar, caught sight of the tattoo and froze. His bloodied lip quivered as realization dawned on him. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "You can't be." The man took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes locked on the leader. "Now you get it," he said quietly. Joe leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's he talking about?" The leader answered for him, his voice trembling. "The Ghost Division," he said, each word heavy with dread. "He's one of them." Joe's breath caught. He had heard the name before, whispers in the news, rumors in the military community. The Ghost Division was a black ops unit, operating in the shadows, taking on missions that no one else could handle. They were a myth to most people, the kind of story soldiers told to scare each other. But to those who knew, they were all too real. The man didn't confirm or deny it. He simply drained his glass and set it down with a soft clink. The leader's anger melted into desperation. "Look, man," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were. If I had, I never would've." The man cut him off with a raised hand. "Stop," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You came in here looking for trouble, and you found it? Now you're going to leave, and you're not coming back." The leader nodded quickly, his earlier bravado replaced by sheer terror. Yeah, we'll leave. Right, guys." The bikers, still sprawled on the floor, nodded hastily. The man leaned closer to the leader, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If I ever see you or your crew again, we won't have this conversation. Understood?" The leader swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood." The man straightened and stepped back, giving them room to leave. The bikers scrambled to their feet, dragging their injured comrades with them. They didn't look back as they stumbled out the door and into the night. Joe watched them go, his heart still racing. When the door swung shut, he turned back to the man. You just let them go, he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The man shrugged. They've learned their lesson. Joe frowned. And if they haven't? The man's expression hardened. Then they'll see what happens when they don't. For a moment, Joe said nothing. Then he let out a shaky laugh. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a few bills from his pocket and placed them on the bar. For the damages, he said. Joe glanced at the money, then back at the man. You're just gonna leave? The man nodded. Trouble has a way of following me. Best if I keep moving. Joe hesitated, then held out a hand. Well, wherever you're headed, good luck. The man shook his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. Thanks, he said. Take care of yourself. And with that, he walked out the door, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had come. Joe stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The jukebox hummed softly in the background, filling the silence with a melancholic tune. The bar would return to normal, the bikers wouldn't dare show their faces again, and life would go on. But Joe knew he'd never forget the quiet man who had come and gone like a shadow, leaving behind nothing but questions and a story no one would believe. The silence in the bar was heavy. Joe leaned against the counter, his knuckles white around the rag he still clutched. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the quiet drifter who had walked into his bar with the force of nature that had just dismantled an entire biker gang in seconds. Outside, the faint rumble of the gang's motorcycles grew distant. Even they, in their bruised and battered state, seemed to sense the urgency of leaving as quickly as possible. The leader's guttural shouts of "get moving" were barely audible over the roar of engines fading into the night. Joe cleared his throat, the only sound in the still bar. You know, I've had my share of rowdy folks come through here, he said cautiously, but I've never seen anything like that. The man didn't respond right away. He turned toward the wall where an old, cracked mirror hung, catching a glimpse of himself. The reflection seemed to weigh on him, as if the face staring back carried memories he wished he could forget. Sometimes, he finally said, his voice low and even, trouble finds you whether you want it or not. Joe nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. Trouble, huh? That what you call what just happened? The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the counter, leaning down to retrieve a stray glass that had miraculously survived the chaos. He placed it carefully on the bar, a strange gesture of normalcy in a moment that felt anything but. Joe took the opportunity to press further. That tattoo, he said, nodding toward the man's wrist. The leader knew what it meant. He was scared out of his mind. The man rolled his sleeve back down, covering the faded ink. It's nothing to worry about, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Nothing to worry about. Joe repeated, his voice rising. You just put 5 guys on the floor like it was nothing. And that was before the knife came out. The man's gaze flicked to the knife still lying on the floor. He picked it up, inspecting it briefly before setting it on the bar. They underestimated me. That was their mistake. Joe narrowed his eyes. That's not an answer. Who are you really? The man hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might deflect again. But then he sighed, a deep, weary sound, and met Joe's eyes. I'm someone who used to be very good at what I did. Too good. Joe felt a chill run down his spine. He had 1,000 questions, but something in the man's expression told him he wouldn't get many answers. Still, he couldn't help but ask, what did you do? The man didn't blink. Whatever needed to be done. At that moment, the door creaked open. Both men tensed, their eyes snapping toward the entrance. A middle-aged woman peeked in cautiously, clutching a handbag to her chest. Is it safe now? She asked, her voice trembling. Joe waved her in, his posture relaxing slightly. Yeah, it's safe. Those guys won't be back. She stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes darting around the room. When she saw the state of the place, her hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! What happened? Joe shot a glance at the man, who remained silent. Just a misunderstanding, Joe said. Nothing to worry about. The woman didn't look convinced, but she nodded. Well, I just came to grab my husband's jacket. He left it here last night. She moved quickly to a corner booth, retrieved a worn denim jacket, and hurried back to the door. Thank you, she said, casting one last wary glance at the man before leaving. As the door closed, Joe turned back to the man. You see? This is why people like you can't just wander into places like this. You leave chaos in your wake. The man chuckled softly, a sound devoid of humor. Trust me, he said, if I could disappear completely, I would. Joe frowned. Why don't you? The man's expression darkened. Because some things don't let you go. No matter how far you run. The hours passed slowly after that. The man remained at the bar, nursing his drink while Joe cleaned up the mess. The jukebox had gone silent, its once cheerful hum now a memory. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old windows of Benny's Roadhouse. Joe finally broke the silence. So, what happens now? You just keep moving, looking over your shoulder. The man stared into his glass, his eyes distant. Something like that. Joe shook his head. That's no way to live. The man smiled faintly. It's not about living. It's about surviving. Joe didn't have a response to that. Instead, he focused on sweeping up broken glass and righting overturned chairs. When he finished, he poured himself a drink and sat down across from the man. You know, Joe said, most people wouldn't do what you did tonight. The man raised an eyebrow. You think I should have let them have their way? Joe shook his head. No. I just think most people wouldn't risk it. Not for a place like this. The man considered this for a moment. Maybe I'm not most people. Joe snorted. Yeah, no kidding. As the clock ticked past midnight, the man stood up and reached for his wallet. I should go, he said, placing a few more bills on the counter. Thanks for the drink. Joe looked at the money, then back at the man. You don't owe me anything, he said. If anything, I owe you. Those guys would have wrecked the place if you hadn't stepped in. The man shrugged. Call it even. Joe watched as he walked toward the door. Hey, he called out. The man paused, his hand on the handle. What's your name? The man hesitated, then turned slightly. Names don't mean much where I'm going. And with that, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. Joe stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The bar was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. He knew he'd never forget the stranger who had come and gone like a storm, leaving behind more questions than answers. The jukebox sputtered to life, playing a soft, melancholic tune. Joe poured himself another drink and sat back down, wondering if he'd ever hear the end of the story or if some stories were meant to remain unfinished. The bikers took their time getting back on their feet. Each of them groaned as they struggled to stand, nursing bruises and cuts that were reminders of just how quickly things had gone south. Their pride, however, was even more battered than their bodies. The leader, still holding his side, shot the bartender a glare so dark that it might have burned through the walls. Joe stood at the bar, wiping down glasses as he tried to hide his smirk. He had seen a lot of tough guys come and go, but nothing like this. The bikers had come in with all their bravado, expecting to run the place. Instead, they had gotten a lesson in humility that they wouldn't soon forget. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a twisted lip, limped over to the door. We're leaving, he muttered, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. but you won't be so lucky next time. The bartender raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Next time, huh? You're welcome to try, but something tells me you won't be back. The gang shuffled out one by one, their pride too wounded to retaliate. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the room broke, and Joe let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The bar had never felt quieter, but in that silence, something had shifted. The balance of power had changed in Benny's Roadhouse. Outside, the gang climbed onto their motorcycles, their movements stiff with pain and frustration. The leader, still fuming, cursed under his breath as he swung his leg over his bike. "This isn't over," he muttered. "We'll find out who that guy was." One of the other bikers, a tall man with a ragged scar across his face, frowned. "You think we can take him?" The leader didn't answer right away. He rubbed his ribs, wincing at the ache. "He's not the kind of guy you mess with. But don't worry, I'll find him. He won't be hard to track down." The rest of the group exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew better than to underestimate the man who had taken them down without breaking a sweat. Their bravado was gone now, replaced by a quiet, simmering fear. The leader kicked his bike into gear, and one by one, the gang sped off into the night, leaving Benny's Roadhouse behind. The sound of their engines echoed through the empty streets, but the bar remained untouched, quiet, and calm once more. Back inside, Joe leaned against the bar, his eyes following the door as if he half expected the bikers to come rushing back in. But he knew they wouldn't. The man who had walked in that night had changed everything. The bikers had picked a fight with the wrong person, and in the end, it wasn't just about getting beaten up, it was about respect. And the man had earned it, without saying a word. Joe glanced over at the man's abandoned chair. The stranger had come in looking like just another wanderer, a man lost in time. But what he had done in those few minutes would be remembered far longer than the bruises on the bikers' bodies. The bartender's thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind the counter. He turned to find a woman standing near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She had been there earlier, just before the bikers showed up, and now she was back. Joe recognized her immediately. She was a local, a regular who often came in to grab a drink on her way home from the night shift at the diner. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon, especially not after everything that had happened. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes darting toward the empty space where the bikers had once stood. "I heard the noise and thought maybe I should come check on you." Joe gave her a reassuring smile. "Yeah, we're fine now. You missed the excitement. The bikers won't be back." She looked skeptical, her gaze flicking toward the door. "What happened?" Joe couldn't help but chuckle. "Let's just say the bikers picked the wrong guy to mess with." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You should have seen it. He took all of them down without breaking a sweat. It was like watching a storm roll in." The woman raised an eyebrow. "A storm, huh? Who was he?" Joe shrugged, shaking his head. "No idea. Just a drifter, I guess. Came in, sat down, and the rest is history." The woman didn't look convinced. "You're telling me that guy took down 5 bikers just like that?" She snapped her fingers for emphasis. "I don't buy it." Joe's smile faded, just a little. "Believe me. He wasn't just some drifter. He knew what he was doing." The woman studied him for a moment, then glanced out the door as if expecting the stranger to walk back in. "Well, I guess if the bikers are gone, that means it's safe to stay." Joe nodded. "Yep, everything's calm again." He poured her a drink, trying to keep the conversation light. "You want your usual?" "Sure," she said, still looking thoughtful. "But I have to ask. Do you think he'll come back?" Joe hesitated, staring at the empty door. He wasn't sure how to answer. There was something about the way the man had walked out of the bar, as if he didn't want anyone to follow him, that made Joe think he wouldn't be back. The man had a purpose, and it didn't seem like it involved staying in one place for too long. "I don't know," Joe said, his voice softer. "But I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't." The days that followed were peaceful, but word about the drifter spread through the town like wildfire. Everyone had their own version of the story. Some said he had been a former soldier, others swore he was a ghost from the past. There were rumors that he had been hunting down the bikers for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Others claimed he had simply stumbled into town, just another man trying to outrun his past. But one thing remained the same. No one dared mess with Benny's Roadhouse again. The bikers had been a loud, aggressive presence, but after that night, they had vanished from the town's streets. No one saw them again, not even at the other local bars. It was as if they had been erased, their fear of the drifter's wrath keeping them far away. Joe never saw the man again, but he wasn't surprised. Some people, he thought, weren't meant to stay. They were meant to do their job, and when their work was done, they left without a trace. As for the bikers, they never caused trouble in the town again. They disappeared, as mysteriously as they had come. No one knew what had happened to them, but their absence spoke louder than anything. Benny's Roadhouse returned to its usual rhythm. The jukebox played softly in the background, and the clink of glass became the soundtrack of the night. The regulars came and went, the quiet ebb and flow of small-town life resuming once more. But every now and then, when the door opened and the wind howled through the cracks in the old building, Joe would look up, half expecting to see the stranger walk back in. And in the silence that followed, he'd remember the man's words, the calm resolve in his voice as he stepped out into the night. Just a guy who doesn't like bullies. And in a way, that was enough. It was the justice that needed to be served, and it had been done. Sometimes, it's not the loudest or the strongest who command respect. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who carry the heaviest stories and the sharpest skills. And for anyone thinking about starting trouble, remember this: you never know who you're really messing with. The truth is, life has a way of surprising you. People often judge others based on what they see on the outside. They look at a man in a worn leather jacket, sitting quietly at a bar, and assume he's nothing more than a wanderer, someone who has lost his place in the world. But what they fail to see is the world he's walked through, the battles he's fought, and the scars he carries. These things aren't visible at first glance. They're hidden deep inside, tucked away behind the calm exterior of a man who's learned to keep his own counsel. People like that don't need to prove anything. They don't shout to get attention or force their way into a conversation. Instead, they wait. They observe. And when the time comes, when their patience runs out and the world demands they step forward, they act with a precision and calm that leaves others in awe. It's not that they're not capable of violence, but that they know the true cost of it and they only use it when absolutely necessary. That man at Benny's Roadhouse? He wasn't just some drifter. He wasn't just passing through. He was a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes, it's the silent ones who hold the most power. And in a world full of noise and bravado, that's a lesson worth remembering. People can be quick to judge. They can look at a quiet person, a loner, and assume they're weak or harmless. They may think that because someone keeps to themselves, they're an easy target. They may think they can push that person around, take advantage, or show them disrespect. But what they don't realize is that every person has a story, one that might not be visible on the surface. And sometimes, those stories hold more strength than any boastful words or flashy displays of power. That night at the bar, those bikers learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they were the loudest, the toughest, the ones in charge. But they were wrong. The man they had picked on wasn't there to fight them. He wasn't there to show them up or to prove something. He was simply there to stand his ground. And when they pushed him too far, they found out the hard way that sometimes, standing your ground is all it takes to make a world of difference. The man didn't need to boast about his skills. He didn't need to tell anyone his past or why he was there. He didn't need to raise his voice or strike fear into anyone's heart. All he had to do was act, and in doing so, he proved that true strength isn't always loud and flashy. It's quiet, focused, and unshakable. Sometimes, we get caught up in the noise of the world. We think that to be respected, to be seen as strong or capable, we need to make a big show of it. We think we need to shout, to force others to notice us, to make sure everyone knows what we can do. But the reality is, the ones who last the longest, who earn the deepest respect, are often the ones who never make a sound. True power doesn't come from showing off. It doesn't come from intimidating others or flexing muscles. It comes from knowing who you are and being confident in that knowledge, no matter what anyone else thinks. It comes from being secure in your abilities, whether anyone else sees them or not. And when the time comes, true power reveals itself in the quietest, most surprising ways. For the bikers, that night at Benny's Roadhouse was a lesson they would never forget. They had come in with their loud, rowdy behavior, thinking they were in control. They had thought they could push around anyone who didn't fit their idea of strength. But the man they chose to pick on wasn't someone who played by their rules. He didn't need to play by anyone's rules. He had his own code. And when they crossed that line, he showed them just what it meant to challenge someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. As the days went by, the town settled back into its usual rhythm. Benny's Roadhouse became just another quiet spot on the map, with the occasional loudmouth coming through, trying to make a scene. But there was a difference now. People who walked into the bar didn't just look around at the familiar faces, they looked around with a new sense of respect. They wondered, who else is here? Who else might be more than they seem? There's a lesson in that. People are full of surprises. You never know who might be sitting next to you at a bar, who might be waiting in line behind you at the store, or who might be standing still, watching and waiting. Everyone has a story, and not all of them are visible. Some are hidden deep inside, where only the most patient can find them. And when you find yourself in a situation where things start to feel tense or uncomfortable, where you're unsure of what might happen next, remember the man at Benny's Roadhouse. Remember that strength isn't about being the loudest or the toughest. It's about knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to remain silent. It's about understanding your own power and not feeling the need to prove it to anyone. Because in the end, those who make the most noise are often the ones who have the least to show for it. As for the bikers, well, they learned a valuable lesson. But they didn't just learn about the drifter. They learned about themselves. They learned that their strength wasn't as absolute as they thought. They learned that there were people in the world who could put them in their place, without raising a fist or even speaking a word. They learned that not everything can be conquered with force or fear. And in that lesson, there was justice. The man didn't just put the bikers down physically, he made them face the truth. They were no longer the kings of the bar. They had been humbled by someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make his presence known. So, the next time you find yourself walking into a room full of loud, confident voices, remember the quiet ones. Remember that the most powerful people often don't need to prove themselves. Their presence alone is enough. And for anyone who thinks they can walk in and take control, remember this: you never know who you're really messing with. Because sometimes, it's the quiet ones who are the ones to be reckoned with. And they always leave the biggest impact.